Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly.
Broadcast from later, we're discussing weak signals of change. These are events and phenomena we notice and suspect may influence futures. I'm Robert Bolton, joined today by Jeremy Glenn, Jackson Scartier, Erica White, Valdez Sillins, and Ryan Planche. Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
Welcome. Ryan is a PhD geography student at Wilfrid Laurier University. He's focused on the economies of indigenous environmental stewardship. Welcome to the show today. Jared, we'll start with you. What is your weakest signal?
So my weakest signal is a book called Wild Urban Plants of the Northeast. It's by an author, Peter Del Tredici, published by Cornell University Press. Peter Del Tredici is a Harvard University botanist, and he's unveiling plants that will become ever more dominant in the urban environments under projected future environmental conditions. So these are plants that are the most important and most common in cities. I think he's focused around North America because he's in Harvard. He's done a lot of focus on Boston. And I also wanted to sort of contrast this with another signal that has just come out, which was the Dyson zone. And I just thought it was funny as like contrasting signals. Basically, the way I see the book is it's a signal that we are leaning into climate change more. So what's funny about these two signals is that the book seems to be taking a stance that says, look, the natural environment has more intelligence than we give it credit for. And rather than adding more to the problem, let's use what exists already and not really change much about what's happening, because he's not even making any arguments to say that we should be adding new plants or diversifying the existing, flora that's there, but just to focus on the plants that are already existing in urban centers, recognizing what they can do, recognizing their inherent intelligence, and leaning into that as a way of saying, yeah, climate change is happening whether we like it or not. And I just thought it was funny comparing that book with this Dyson zone, which is basically like more stuff. It's more stuff we're going to put into the environment. And it's also there because it's supposed to be like an air filtration system, which also happens to have that's attached to noise canceling headphones. So it's really about like almost not so much embracing the environment, but trying to shut out the environment and not have to think about it anymore with this piece of gadgetry. So rather than a design tech solution to climate change, the book is saying, here, look, these plants already know what they're doing. Let's just learn more about them, understand what they do, and get a better sense for what our environment is about. So I like that in the sense that they're both sort of signaling, they're both sort of leaning into climate change, but one is doing so with less of a design tech focus. So yeah, that's my signal.
Just want to clarify, because that was a lot really quick. So what is it that's exactly happening with these wild urban plants? Like what kind of plants are emerging? And
I mean, it's a field guide. So really what he's doing is he's pointing out what are the most common plant species within most urban environments. And that can be anything, depending on where you are. That could be something that was considered an invasive species or a native species. And he's kind of saying look, all these species have already been introduced to these urban environments. And in some cases, they're actually helping. So we shouldn't be so concerned about trying to remove non-native species and focusing on native species. What we should do instead is increase our knowledge of all of the sort of most prevalent urban plant species, especially ones that have particular, let's say, intelligence that can mitigate any existing damage being done in the environment. So, for instance, certain species of reeds apparently are good at cleaning up particular contaminated water. It's about just sort of educating ourselves better on what these species are and how we can benefit from them.
The signal for you is this attitude, like this response?
Yeah, I think it's just kind of saying look, we know climate change is happening. It's happening already. So rather than trying to focus on some external solution, let's look at some solutions that already could exist within our environment.
Do you feel like, and for everybody, that this is an argument for less intervention in general? And is that something that seems like the good idea. I get it as a response to sort of so many agro and other engineering interventions over the past, hundreds of years, or all of human history if you want, that maybe seem to have led us to some pretty awful places as far as environment and climate. But is that the feeling, and how does everyone feel about that?
Yeah, I think so. I think let the plants do what they know how to do best, and defer a bit to nature to see what it can do.
Do nothing.
Especially since the solution from the tech sector is that we should be intervening in even more extreme ways, like with genetic engineering and such. So I like how this is just a very elegant solution to how complex ecosystems are. It's like, we're not smart enough to hack them. They've had like millions of years of experience of healing themselves. So
I like this do nothing approach too. I think it's an interesting instance where you can tease out some of the scales of what that invasive quality of the species that we're talking about in terms of plants looks like, right? So there would be different sort of scales of what invasive means and where it means that it's invasive. So if it's choking out something that we would kind of consider useful and native, then we're kind of thinking about it in terms of how to mitigate its spread. But when we talk about urban spaces, we're so removed from what kind of native species might be. Yeah, I like this sort of do nothing approach to it.
Valdez, any thoughts on this?
I ordered the book, so
yeah?
That didn't take long. Because
within seconds of hearing about it.
Yeah, I just went to the page. The do nothing thing, depends on how you interpret what that means. I'm weary of interpreting it to mean just we need to pull back from doing stuff altogether. It's kind of what that example to me speaks to, is that we just get to understand. He's a landscape architect, from my understanding, when I looked him up. So he actually does do his job is literally intervention, right? And sculpting and building, reforming, right? And he's creating forms. And to me, what he's saying is just hey, you don't just impose a form on a place. Forms emerge from this living process of interaction. And so we have to pay attention to that. And that, I think, is an interesting approach to design and intervening in the environment. But it's not do nothing. It's just be aware of the way that you don't impose form on the environment. The form emerges from sort of interventions, that you make within it. And that to me is interesting as an approach to design in general, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm wary also of the idea of do nothing. I think it's something that appeals. You can feel oh yeah, everything we've done has caused problems and everything but thinking about do things more thoughtfully, learn from our past mistakes, be more attentive to our environments when we do that. Because it's hard for me to say what would it actually look like for humans to not intervene? Do we even know what that means? Do we even know what that looks like? We are actors within our environments and have sort of behaved a certain way over the entirety of human history. It doesn't mean we have to, but it's sometimes it's unclear to me what it actually looks like to do nothing and whether it's truly better, as much as it can feel appealing these days, because we can look back and be look at everything we've tried to do has ruined our ecosystems.
But I think Valdez touched on an interesting thing with it being how we intervene, because I've been doing all this research on forests and how people interact with forests or just plants and in general. And it's interesting how gardening is a really interesting example of intervening with environment in a way that's mutually beneficial. Gardens create biodiversity and can really benefit the area for a century afterwards without even continuing to interact with the space. So that's an example of being a net positive interaction. So it's more so what are the principles that are governing how people intervene? Sometimes you want to intervene, but you're just going to break it, versus how are you intervening in a way that's thoughtful and informed?
This week I was thinking about how like lawn care is basically like an accidental geoengineering project, because it's like it's so carbon intensive and reduces biodiversity and is just like so like the North American version of lawns is so crazy to me. And I know people talk about this a lot. The ways that we like don't realize the consequences like of our actions, I think, is another part of this too. And like I think the way people used to think design worked was like you had a form, you made it, you put it somewhere, and then that was it. You didn't like pay attention to what was called like post-use occupancy, as though it was like a traumatic experience to look at like how people in nature actually use the things that you put into the world.
That's really interesting to contrast like how people mow their lawns, like they have to do it every week. Like it's really intensive. It's about like optimizing, like the grass has to be like a perfect like height or whatever versus kind of like the behavior of like gardening where you're cultivating and it's more like slow. You don't necessarily have to like upkeep too much. Those different modes are interesting.
Yeah, Jack, is there a particular definition of gardening that's coming with this point, or is it like what you said? It doesn't feel like universal, but maybe I don't know the right definition of gardening or something like that. Like, is this about gardening for food, or like?
That's actually a good question. Like, what's like because I've come across, for example, like forest gardens, which I spoke to you before about how indigenous groups on the West Coast used to cultivate like seeds and like root vegetables and different kinds of species of plant in an area. And it wasn't done in a process that was like agriculture where you plant your seeds, you harvest, and it's like this continuous like monoculture kind of process of developing food. It was for like the aesthetics of the place, so like creating biodiversity, but also for creating this like diverse range of food that they could pull from. You see like this kind of like food example of gardening, and then also like the other more like aesthetic examples of gardening. Yeah, I mean, what's in common between those two? Yeah, that's interesting. I can't get to it right now.
Yeah, the distinctions we're talking about are super interesting too, because it's like how to actually get at what the differences are. There's like this sort of thing like, why does it seem like a bad idea to plant like the seeds in specific places in a row versus doing something that like you want to use words like holistic or like attuned or you know what I mean, like, or just an approach that kind of is going with the natural flow of things, whatever that means. It feels like something that's better and more sustainable and so on. But it's sort of an odd thing of like where to draw the line in terms of what's are they both not interventions in some way? Do they both not have the intent of like solving or something like that? And yeah, I don't know where to think about drawing those lines. It's like it's a strange thing, but I imagine it's true for everyone else. Certainly in my head, there is this idea of like two paths in terms of like there's a sort of binary there.
I think that's where permaculture kind of came in at one point. I'm not exactly sure the origins of permaculture, but I feel like that's when it's supposed to act as this like bridge, more holistic form of agriculture, a little bit of tactility in terms of gardening, and there are very specific principles around permaculture that guide and bridge those two spaces between agriculture and gardening.
Yeah. But that's what's so interesting, is that the idea of specificity almost seems counter to the idea of permaculture in a weird way.
Yeah, the other thing that's kind of interesting is there's a video that accompanies the book on the Cornell Press website where the author's talking a lot about the book and other things he's discovered as a result of writing it. And, one of the things he sort of says is like, we should try to take the perspective of plants and sort of, try to understand exactly what the pressures on them are and try to see the world through like the eyes of the plant, which I thought was kind of an interesting way of looking at things.
Is this author a plant? Is he a quisling of the humans and trying to deceive us and convinced by the plants? Doesn't he know that they're out to slowly kill and eat us?
I actually really like the theory that wheat is domesticating us because we've like built so much of our life around it.
Totally.
I just think it's so fascinating to think about. Yeah, that we built the farm, our farmhouses around wheat and like died over wheat.
Yeah, I mean, pretty flowers too, right?
History.
Like, that's an example like that.
Just to think about plants domesticating us rather than us domesticating plants is also a flip on that POV.
Yeah, violent creatures. Valdez is our resident plant empathy expert who spearheaded our project Fertilizer that was really about the plant sensing and intelligence mechanisms. Did you have any thoughts on what it is to feel like a plant, Valdez?
I never used the word empathy, so to deny that attribution. I don't think.
On plant sensing and intelligence.
The stuff, Jeremy, you were talking about around what plants do in urban environments, they can be, like, practically speaking, a real hassle for a lot of stuff too. And they like trees will wrap their roots around like water veins and like try to get access to the water, and I'm speaking as though it has a kind of agency or whatever. I mean, it seeks out, from what I understand, either like humidity or even like, and this is maybe a little more controversial, but the vibrations of water moving through pipes. So it has some ability to sense even like almost an acoustic, or well, not almost, literally an acoustic phenomena, and move towards those pipes and then eventually crush them and break them and stuff like that. And so when you're talking about integrating plants into the urban environment, there's like questions of like, practically, like, how do you do that? It's not easy. It's not just do nothing. It's like very much like figure out how to arrange infrastructure to kind of, I don't even know what the terms are here. I'm like way out of my depth, but
it's interesting though. Yeah, it is one, like that's a good point though, that as you start to think about it, like lots of problems arise where you need to figure out how to arrange these things with some sort of at least guidance, if that's a better word than intervention or engineering. To your point about it not being empathy, yeah, fair enough. I guess thinking about that though, I experienced myself and in when we were working on that project Fertilizer, and I remember you recounting too, just having completely different sensing experiences, like while thinking a lot like that. So like thinking about plants and how they sense, exist, and even having that idea of agency. And it's I think really interesting that the idea of plant empathy or whatever we're talking about is coming up, because I guess like braiding sweetgrass feels like a really important sort of like text of our time in terms of it's been really influential. It has a huge readership and is influencing a lot of people to think differently about and feel differently is probably a better way to put about like the plants that they exist around and the trees that they exist around and the natural world that they exist around. So something's happening there. I think there's like a change occurring, a shift of some sort. I don't know what you could compare that to in the past, but it like makes me think of like The Prophet by Khalil Gibran in the 30s or something like that. It's like this overall new, somewhat mystical text to live by that people are adopting.
Yeah, it's interesting. The other thing I wanted to mention was that he refers to this kind of process of almost like rewilding as post-industrial succession. So it's based on this concept of field succession, which would have happened, when people would have clear-cut forests in order to make arable land for crops. And say the land eventually was abandoned, and then slowly the whatever natural plants that were there, plants that existed before, start sort of coming back to life and bringing all these new species back into that field. So that would have been called field succession. And so he sort of sees this as what he calls post-industrial succession.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating that it is kind of articulated as a shift like that, and that there might be some kind of like agricultural, botanical, spiritual, like converging shift or something happening here. Ryan, you've been taking lots of notes as we've been talking. What do you have some thoughts you want to?
No, I was just to Erica's point about permaculture. I was thinking about the communities that I work in. The territories are kind of doing like a hybrid agroecology practice, which is really that kind of infusion of agriculture and permaculture practiced together, and in the way that community members, specifically Decho Dene peoples, are thinking about kind of their extended kin-based relationships. So they are talking about more than human or non-human entities, right? And considering flora and fauna, or like lands and waters and animals as part of that. It's really hard to get away from that sort of like human centered, what is agency? How do we give that to something? And like consider it in terms of personhood. But I think, and I'm not like an expert in this field or anything, but I think when I imagine the logical end of that, I just think about kind of taking the, like, it's not something you bequeath. It's something that exists already that you're kind of managing to hold space to notice. And so doing that hyper aware situated practice, I think really helps. And when you sort of have thousands of years of experience, like living in reciprocity with more than human entities, that you really have like natural limits to live within, right? In terms of like subsistence and food, I can't even begin to imagine like the other relationships that you would develop with these things and those, yeah. But it's really coming from like this, being educated in this sort of settler colonial system. It's really hard, like, unless you have like an elder as a friend, you don't really have a way to kind of think around that person-centered viewpoint or like human-centered viewpoint. Yeah.
But yeah, and maybe people are starting to develop it. I mean, I love the idea of developing that kind of sensitivity to the level where you can actually defer to the experts on carbon sequestration, or the trees themselves. I mean, those are they're the ones with the experience here, and being able to actually pay attention and let them make decisions or influence decisions. Signal or noise, Erica?
I guess if the signal is that we should let plants do their thing, and that they have a lot to offer in terms of their capacity to sense. I'm just thinking about like the way we want to, attach little sensors to plants to like listen to them all of a sudden and make music with plants. There's a lot of that, but I don't know if it's everywhere. I think it's very niche still. So yeah, the capacity to listen to plants in a deeper way is really weird and interesting. And I'm not sure what to make of that. But then also, I think it's also on the flip really interesting when we let plants do the sensing for us. There are things we can use. There's devices, sensors, what have you, to glean into what's happening to our environment, and if there's like any kind of toxicity happening or pollution but the environment is already doing that, and you have plants kind of popping up to mediate that. And so perhaps that bridges that piece about actually listening to what the plants are saying or like what they are doing. So yeah, I do think it's a signal. I'm just unsure how that becomes more common with people or what have you. I'm not sure what needs to happen there, but I do find it really interesting that you can like look to plants rather in terms of what's going on in your environment. And then they have a lot of information there in terms of what's happening.
Ryan, what do you think? Signal or noise?
I would say that it's a signal. I like that we've gone to this place where we're talking about it in terms of like agency. I think that's an important signal that, we can talk about it in terms of plants, but I think in general, just this consideration of how we think about agency or what has agency seems really important to me.
Valdez, signal or noise?
Yeah, noise. I'll just say noise. But no, not in a dismissive way. One thing to respond to like an idea that was implicit, that wasn't being spoken, I think is I don't think there's such a thing as like Western knowledge. Like, I don't think that makes sense as a category. And so I don't think we can like juxtapose that against other forms. Like, I think within that thing that is called Western knowledge, there's all sorts of different strands. And some of the first like people in that tradition to think about the intelligence of plants was Darwin. Is literally, I mean, he's like the embodiment of what you would think of as like a tradition that's quote unquote like dominating other things in nature. And yet I don't think that's the case at all. I think there's like plenty of minor strands within every way of thinking. And I don't think there should be a juxtaposition. That's basically what I'm getting at. It doesn't make sense to me. So in that sense, this idea that like was being hinted at, that there's like a paradigm shift in like spirituality or how we like feel and think about plants, like I also don't think that's like true either. I think it's like been there this whole time, and it's always been like a part of how scientists experience the natural world and make sense of it. And so because we have like a new focus on it, to me, it's more interesting in like recovering all those other strands of like how we thought about it, sensed it, and felt it.
Jack, signal and noise.
It's actually curious that, Valdis, that you were saying that, because like if anyone's seen like the Versailles, it's like this very like orderly way of organizing nature. Whereas in England, like English gardens are very popular, where it's like this more wild, you like kind of like let things be. So there is that philosophy around letting things be has always kind of been there. So I think if the signal is we should temper our impulse to intervene in natural processes and maybe like recognize, like check our sense that we're smarter than the natural systems around us, I definitely think it's a signal. There's also other evidence there, like there's species, like there's coral reef species that are evolving with changes in like ocean temperature and stuff like that. So there's also other kind of data points I'm kind of thinking about. So yeah, I would say it's a signal if that's like the interpretation of it.
Yeah, I think it's a signal as well. Ryan, what's your weakest signal?
Something that came out of the work that I'm doing about alternative economic systems. And it's actually very much in line with what we've already been speaking about. So in part, it's really about considering how to kind of tether our centralized economic procedures or systems or configurations to kind of more, just within limitations of like specific regions, let's say. So I'm using this term by a scholar called Glen Coulthard, who wrote the book called Red Skin, White Masks. So he has this idea of grounded normativity. He is Yellowknife Dene himself, and he teaches at, I think it's UVic. And so his perspective in the book, or one of the perspectives, is he comes with this term called grounded normativity, which is really about understanding how place-based practices kind of inform your actions, processes, knowledge systems. And in the case of the book, these sort of traditional ecological knowledges or indigenous knowledge systems, I started taking that up and thinking about it in terms of economies. So the work that I'm doing is really conservation-based economic systems. So that kind of mostly lives in a kind of indigenous protected and conserved areas space. So, but it's very much an indigenous-led process. So I started thinking about, okay, well, what are the economies of that? Like, how are these things created? What are the political economies? What are the financial economies? And so this sort of comes in line with these bigger conversations about things like natural capital and circular economies. So when I talk about it, I'm thinking about it in terms of taking Glen Coulthard's terminology around these sort of practices being grounded, being like tethered to land-based experiences, which are very like situated and regional, and then talking about economies that kind of relate to that. So I've sort of termed it grounded economies, but that's sort of the context. What I'm thinking about are kind of decoupling this sort of capitalist mode of production we have that's got us into this place environmentally, and then talking about how we can reframe what economies are, right? So if you kind of suspend your belief that economies are purely monetary or financial inputs and outputs, then we can start talking about some of the other really interesting value creation that come with other worldviews, right? And, you know, and your own as well. I don't think everyone has the same experience of like how they do economies. And so I think we're just sort of always sort of lumping in this idea that we're generating personal wealth and being involved in capital, but I think it really is a lot more nuanced for everyone, you know, really in that system. But I don't hear a lot of that conversation happening. But so in particular, I'm sort of interested in indigenous modes of economy, and then how we can learn from some of those experiences. And I think also, just on really basic terms, it's not monolithic, of course, across Canada or the globe. So really you have to look at it in terms of like these really situated practices that are specific or endemic to their ecologies, right? I think there's a lot of talk about sort of environmental economics and these sort of ecological economic systems, but I still see them kind of relying on a sort of financial backbone, input, output. So I'm trying to figure out if there's a signal there, which is why I think it's pretty weak, to start talking about how to kind of get to a different place in terms of economies or how we think about those systems.
Do you have a definition of economy that you find useful for this conversation?
Usually if I'm writing about it, I talk about it in terms of like modes of collective action. So that can look like a bunch of activity that's usually used to generate whatever the values are of that economic system. So, we would talk about it in terms of wage labor, maybe in our centralized system. But then if we want to talk about it in terms of like other value creations, there's many different things you can say. So I guess, just like sort of modes of action that would reproduce that economy, make the belief system happen and whatever that. And then thinking about it too in terms of currency. So like what are the values that create the currencies in that system? It's just very hard to decouple your kind of thinking about that. For me anyways, that's not financial. So I often use the example of a polar bear. So for like Inuit folks practicing a kind of version of subsistence practice, there's a lot of other values that polar bears represent. They're also financial, right? They're also monetary, but they create like thousands of years of existence and reciprocity with polar bears creates culture and art and storytelling. And then it also influences a kind of value that elders and youth have together to learn how to be with polar bears. There's all kinds of different values created in that system. And often we just look at it in terms of like, okay, well, what's the financial in and out? And that's like, it just seems like such a small version of what's actually happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. There's a lot of a lot of different directions, or I guess different starting places, I think, with this signal. Is there, and I appreciate that it's like a very weak one for you in terms of like understanding what it could mean. Is there a particular way that you might suspect or that you've been thinking about like how this unfolds and where it leads, what it leads to? Either hope or not, or
it's definitely a hope. That's a good question. I don't really know even what the hope looks like, but what part of that is really being able to detach from these really kind of dehumanizing outputs of that centralized economic system. So I guess one would be creating these very regional economies that are responsive in like ways I couldn't imagine, that are very like throughout the country, if we want to talk about Canada specifically. So instead of like we're all kind of buying into this idea that, this is money, this is capital, this is how we do that, this is how we reproduce it. It's sort of like regionally becomes invisible to each place because those responses have to be, so location specific or place based. But I mean, also I would love to just like throw away this idea of money, but I think that's like a much more impossible thing to start with.
Right. But giving sort of less power to money at a local level is kind of how you're interesting. What are just for specificity, the dehumanizing outputs of the system you're talking about that you're thinking of?
Yeah. So, I mean, a few authors write about capital in terms of like how it deterritorializes. So like if we look at like just, the colonial exercise, we think about, colonists coming over to Eastern and Western Canada, and part of that impetus is to like have land to build capital from, so like to produce private ownership or property regimes. And so for Indigenous folks, a lot of times when you talk about economies, this conversation of dispossession comes up. And so David Harvey and Cole Harris have written about how the practice of capitalism specifically dehumanizes your relationship to a specific location. So you're meant to kind of like pick up your connections to the ground that you're on in all those different ways, and then kind of participate in a different centralized system that doesn't really care about where you're from. So kind of that's where the deterritorialization comes in. And I just feel like when we're so removed from that, myself included, it's really hard to even imagine like what would my other experience have been without that. Like I feel like it's so far behind my ancestry to even like think about that. But for Indigenous folks, obviously it's a little bit more clear in terms of like their own peoples and territories and places. So,
right.
Yeah.
The other phrase you used that I was interested in was natural capital, and sort of got me thinking about like, is all capital, either way, is all capital natural, or is all capital actually like not natural, depending if it's just like a lens that we're placing upon things. And also, or is there something like a continuum of sort of the naturalness? But yeah, if you wanted to even define that, if I have the right frame for understanding it or not.
Yes, natural capital. It's a weird one. I think it's not really decided in terms of like the literature, like research. I think it's starting to be used in policy discourse in Canada and a few other places.
Okay, cool. What
But
is it meaning for you?
It's sort of like natural resources. So if you think about like, I don't know, nickel, think of nickel or gold as natural capital, then you have these sort of other considerations you have to take into account instead of purely financial. So like you would think about its ecosystem or cultural services that are attached to those commodities. So it's a kind of a little bit bigger of a picture, but I still think that when we talk about things like that in terms of capital, it doesn't really move far enough away from our traditional systems to do what it's trying to do. That's my sense of it.
There are a lot of different directions, I think, when you talk about place-based and different types of economies. And I guess the first thing that came to mind, just as you were mentioning the resource bit and about these like natural type of capital, is the giving rivers and certain natural resources personhood. I think that's probably a really good example of just, like you mentioned in the past signal, giving natural resources some sort of agency, but also the relationship between perhaps how we currently understand our resources, landscapes, and the protection and treatment of certain resources. So I kind of think that's what your natural capital could be in this case as well. I know you had like a bit of a loose definition there, but the river personhood popped up to mind when you just start talking about resources a little bit.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was thinking about in terms of agency. Yeah, like I think it's the Magpie River in Quebec that was granted like legal personhood. And there's one more in BC that's about to be legislated. And there's another one in New Zealand. I think there's a couple, but it's fairly new in terms of like legal systems to grant something personhood.
Yeah, it's interesting. Ryan and I had spoken a bit about this before, and I was saying like, for me to consider what it means to adopt alternative economic models is you have to kind of look at like what are the building blocks in any type of economy, whether that's like trade based or what have you. And I think part of what this work seems to be doing is codifying some discrepancies between like existing exploitative economies. And I think when we were talking about it, Ryan, we sort of realized one of the issues is this idea of, I think the term that we used was beneficial extraction. So like, for instance, money markets have a lot of mechanisms whereby people can benefit without contributing anything to the system. They're benefiting by just extracting something from someone else, and they're not adding anything to the equation. So it's like a way to start differentiating the ways that we can look at economic models. I think this is like an excellent first step.
Yeah, we talked about beneficial extraction. Yeah, like things that are going to reinforce some of those systems without needing to become these big centralized or like destructive projects. I think in terms of like indigenous folks, the people that I work with in Samba K, so they're in the Dehcho region, Northwest Territories, so just above the Alberta border. And they had a team come in from Northern Agricultural Futures, which is an agroecology focused group. And they were talking about greenhouses and sort of like land-based, production. And they asked them if they would like to do some research starting like a fish, because they are on a big lake. It's called Trout Lake. And they were like, do you want to do some fish, like canning or whatever? And they were like, so here's the thing. Like in their culture, they can't sell anything that they harvest from the land or that the land gives them, right? So they don't trade like specifically money for things that they get from the land. So while they're like happy to do the trade, and usually those things are gifted, right? Or spread throughout like your direct family, there immediately is like this kind of impossible notion of like going in to create money from like resources like this. Plants are a little bit different, but and there's like spaces that are just for bones. There's like a bone graveyard, and like every type of waste has a different place to decompose. This is really just a completely different worldview in terms of like trade and exchange. But part of that thing that interested me is like, there's still a value, there's still an economy there. It's just like, what are the values? Like, what are we talking about that's important? And like, why are those things important? Like, I don't know if other people think about, they're like, doing jobs or whatever, and they get money for it. And they like, of course we all need that. But like, what are the things that you actually do that create value for yourself that doesn't really have anything to do with how you make that money? Where does that value come from for you? And like, is it necessary to have money to do that?
It's interesting you mentioning this, because there's a lot of parallels with what you're saying and how policy and strategies in corporate environments are changing to think about beyond financial incentives. So ESG stands for environmental, social governance, and it's being discussed within the SEC right now in the US that companies should start disclosing how they impact people and their environment when they engage in commerce. And so while this is like different from what you're talking about, it seems like it's converging at a place where it's alternative economies, like kind of how you're mentioning indigenous contexts. There, it comes from this place of what contributes to your value in a more kind of like holistic, genuine way. Whereas there's like this top-down movement that's coming in policy and in corporations where they're like, we need to think about the broader context around our financial activities. Valt's is probably rolling his eyes as I talk about ESG because we have disagreements about this. But I just want to mention that.
I think that's really connected. I worked for a company called ESG Tree, doing some research for them. I think they're based in Waterloo, and they're like a startup, they're a fintech startup, and they're having trouble kind of convincing some of their partners. So they wanted to look at it, the bigger picture, right? Like, what were they actually contributing to, what the values were in place? So I think those things are really, really in line. And like, where did that come from? Like, where is it pressure from like citizens that they're noticing, or is it like individuals in the company? Yeah, part of that bigger change for sure.
Something that also came up, and I think Rob mentioned this, Robin Kamara from who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, she writes about a commons economy, and that's an economy where resources, again, are thought of to not be stacked against nature and are not commodified in a particular fashion that they are currently. So her foundations around that are like around well-being, water, land, forests. And I think the term common economy is interesting in this case in terms of how you're mentioning that there are these like place-based territories popping up and that they are valuing indigenous ways of life. I think, I just think the book Braiding Sweetgrass also does a really good job at, articulating the differences in how value is created, how economy and how an economy can be thought of with indigenous values in mind. Also with that, it's like how gifting is really important in those traditions and in those realms, and how that can be put forward outside of, or how do we uphold like some of the functions of a gift economy and then truly live in that.
It's really hard to do.
I'm just a little less familiar with like the ESG index, and I do find indexes to be super valuable and super in guiding the way an organization or a corporation is tracking their like footprint or thinking about their processes. And I'm trying to also understand where the connection is between that kind of index and something happening in like a decommodified resource environment.
Agreed. It's a hard connection to make, I think, for sure. Rana Koponen, who is a Sami scholar, who teaches at U of T. Actually, she teaches at in Finland now, but she did a whole series of writings on the gift economy as like a different part of that commons conversation that you started with. The gift economy is interesting because it's really like, it's such a problematic thing to start to piece together and implement. I don't think it's ever kind of meant to be practiced on the scale that we're kind of operating at the moment.
Yeah.
Globally.
Seems like such a hard thing to go back from, even from just the way things are quantified today. The phrase grounded normativity, sorry, I'm just like, I want the lexicon down today, is a really interesting one as well. Could you give a bit, I know that was sort of the term you were kind of using for this broader conversation in general, but do you want to take a stab at defining that one as well?
Yeah, I have Coulthard's definition in front of me, which I'll lean on because I'm going to destroy it if I don't. Mm-hmm. So he talks about indigenous struggles against capitalist imperialism. Mm-hmm. So he's talking about them as being best understood as struggles oriented around the questions of land. So struggles not only for land, but also deeply informed by what the land as a mode of reciprocal relationship, right, with which is itself formed by place-based practices and associated forms of knowledge, ought to teach us about living our lives in relation to one another and our surroundings in a respectful, non-dominating, non-exploitative way. So ethical framework that provides is grounded normativity. So it's being in that direct relationship with non-human entities, doing that through reciprocity, that practice of like, give and take in the natural system is this idea of grounded normativity. So normative in terms of like the way that the knowledge system is oriented. So it's normal for that to be grounded is normal in that, is normalized in that knowledge system.
Interesting. And then bringing it to the, I guess, economic side, you used the term tethered, which is, I guess, almost synonymous with grounded in this case. Like you're meaning tethered to the land, the locality. Yeah. Yeah,
like
it's interesting.
To think about it in terms of anchors, like having something that makes you not be able to make it a centralized system.
Yeah.
Lift it off the ground.
Yeah. It's fascinating. When you get to that, it does feel like there's, as far as this being like a signal, some room to start to develop a way of thinking about economics that actually is somewhat interoperable with existing systems, maybe, or even if it involves evolving them in some way. And that's interesting. I mean, it makes me sort of think, okay, like, yeah, there's something here. And it's an interesting signal also in that in some ways I feel everything we're talking about to be really obvious. And in other ways, it's like, being able to see that where it goes is actually not so, is a little more challenging, and it feels like it does require quite a bit more deep reflection. Shall we, signal or noise? Erica, what do you think?
You brought up some really nice terminology that I'm very interested in, how it contributes to land development regulations and what we then qualify as like a public realm. I've been really interested in this idea of form-based code. I think what you've mentioned with these like alternative economies and the kind of principles they uphold could be understood as a form-based code in terms of how we understand land. So I do think it's a signal, mostly because I am really interested in this idea of form-based code and what that actually entails. And I think there's a lot of interesting language and values that you've brought up that could encompass that.
I think the idea of some reopening of the question of value, I think seems like apparent that that's like at least a minor trend, and minor not in the sense of like that people aren't talking about it, but minor in the sense that it's not changing anything yet, right? Like, but there are lots of discussions of what value is. And I mean, degrowth comes to mind, where that was like specifically the entire point of what degrowth is to open up the question of what value is. And so to not have it be defined in strictly economic terms, but to actually think through how we go about building systems of production, distribution, consumption that are not only determined through market relations. The other forms of deliberation can be part of that process of determining what we make as a society. So I think it's part of that. And then the indigenous land-based stuff is interesting. So I get sometimes uncomfortable with like too much focus on land-based claims, because then it feels like it drifts into, I don't know if there's like a political horseshoe type of thing, but like you could land-based claim, like I come from Eastern Europe, and land-based claims there, it's like a very uncomfortable topic and not one I really feel like I want to back in any way. And I know that the term means different things in different places, so I'm not dismissing it, but I'm just kind of getting at what the connotations that come up with me, and linking rights to like who's like tethered to the land. It feels can be dangerous in some ways, possibly. I would just say it sits at a level that's so general that I can't say if it's a signal or not. You know, it's like, I think it's definitely a topic to talk about, but I can't rate it as yes or no because of just the generality.
Jack?
Yeah, it's because the way that I would conceptualize it as a signal is if people are going to start localities, communes where they organize differently. And I mean, we've like worked on memory work from later, which is like a scenario about that basically expands on that notion. So I think people are talking about it. Is it something that people would actually do? Again, that's like my framing, not taking in the entire like generality of the idea. I'm not sure yet, because also I look at things like ESG that's trying to be influenced by people who are in power, who have all this like influence behind them. And it's questionable how effective they're changing the notion of value as well. So I don't know. I'm undecided.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say it's a signal. You need new terminology to start having new conversations about particular subjects, and creating a new term starts people thinking about new ways of dealing with these situations, what kind of vocabulary you need around it. And as that continues to happen, I think you may see more and newer forms of economic model coming out. Part of what makes this challenging is scale, right? It's totally fine to talk about local economies and local trade. As soon as you start scaling that and trying to think about, relative forms of capital, and, like the monetary system is based on some, representational form of capital. Once you start bringing in more complex and larger scaled systems, that makes it a little more challenging, I think, to think about this. But again, I think it's about starting to develop the vocabulary around these systems. So I'll say noisy signal.
Yeah, it could be that these are notions that depend very much on not being scalable as well. But I think it's a weak signal, and I'm totally comfortable saying that, not really understanding where it exactly goes and how. But it feels like a weak signal to me. Jack, what's your weakest signal?
So I've been researching about genetically engineered trees, which isn't regulated, obviously. But basically, I was reading about this startup called Living Carbon. And for a long time, like since the 90s, scientists have kind of talked about how biohacking trees could be a way to mitigate the climate crisis. So helping trees grow faster, absorb more carbon and such. So what I thought was interesting with this company is, well, it's the fact that they're doing that and it's like not regulated at all in the US. It's really hard to get past that regulation. Like the US and Canada have some of the most protected forests in the world. And for obvious reasons, like it's like the blood life of our ecosystems. Like if you screw with the forest, like you're screwing with the land. For example, there was this American chestnut tree that it was this old growth species on the East Coast, like massive trees that were beautiful. And anyways, in like 1874, someone brought over like a Japanese maple or something, and it released like a fungi disease that killed over 4 billion trees, completely wiped out the American chestnut within 80 years. And basically they tried to genetically engineer that tree in a different context to bring it back. And so that was more, it could fight that like disease. And even they can't get approval. So anyways, so you see this company that's trying to get approval for doing this. And the way that they were talking about trees was, oh, you know, photosynthesis, it's like really unproductive, it's really inefficient. So like, you know, trees waste like 95% of like the resources in photosynthesis, and kind of talking about like trees, like they were this like really unproductive thing that had to be like changed. And of course, like the CEO has like a tech background. You can just see kind of like the cultural perceptions and attitudes kind of coming into this way of viewing plants. But I just thought that was really interesting because I thought of a future where people view trees on their property or around them as like these like working entities that are producing oxygen for them. Maybe there's like tools to like test like how much oxygen, how productive is my tree being in my front yard, and just kind of viewing trees in this very different way. Like obviously the forestry industry has always been around. There's always been deforestation, using timber for various reasons, but the shift of like developing a business model around genetically engineered trees that produce more oxygen, where like this startup, their business model basically is to work with private landowners, plant these genetically engineered trees that produce more oxygen and take in more carbon, and to basically use it as carbon credits, and like a portion of that would be given to the private landowners. So it's just interesting kind of viewing this like tech perspective of solving the climate crisis, basically. Yeah, so that's why I like Weak Signal of
I love that we've gone from do nothing to do too much over the course of this. And also, yeah, it's funny. It's like the this notion of personhood that's come up. It's like, okay, well, if the trees are going to be persons, they better get to work. They'll have to be laborers too, apparently, and meet their quotas.
They need a wage to get nice things, you know, like blankets and baths and whatever, right?
And healthcare.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I still say the same point of like, so there's scientists that are really advocating for this because they think it's a solution. Like I think 700 scientists signed a petition about deregulating this, funding research. But there's been so much research on the promise of genetically engineering trees to reduce their like decomposition rate or to increase their ability to take in carbon. But there's been like very little research done on what it does to create risk in the environment once you introduce like this artificially made tree. So the only other two instances where this has been like introduced into the national environment is in Brazil, and that project failed. It was around like eucalyptus trees. The other one was around in poplar trees in China. I forget like the type of tree, but it was a poplar tree. And they grew, it's called like the green wall. And it's basically to minimize the risk of desertification. So you can do this thing where you stunt the reproduction of an artificial tree. So it's called basically it's like the seeds are suicide seeds or like terminator seeds or something, where when a tree produces seeds, it doesn't reproduce. So what happened with these trees is they were so genetically advantageous that they became an invasive species in other parts of China. So you like completely kind of like screw with the ecosystem, because I think pollen from pine trees can travel 3,000 kilometers. So it's like you might like plant a tree within an ecosystem in California, but like it could affect like places very far away from California. It's like a very viable solution for maybe like minimizing some of these issues with the climate crisis, but also it's like you can make a situation far worse by trying to tweak with something that's not fully understood. Genetically modified trees or forests, to the fact that there's like genetically modified crops, and there's people who feel really negatively about that, but some scientists are like, well, who knows? There hasn't really been like too many negative research about it. Like there isn't really scientific consensus around that. So they kind of look at that and they say, oh, well, if that's possible, this is possible. But like when you think about how functional growing crops is, like literally just to develop something that's edible. Also, it's negative because it's like it's based on developing these monocultures. Like trees are so much more complex because they're not being grown for 3 months. They're being grown for like years and decades. And like their roots kind of facilitate this communication network and forests and kind of determine where resources go. And like trees are much more complex. And yeah, like I said, they're like the lifeblood of ecosystems in most cases. So playing around with them, I don't know.
They call it the Tesla of trees, which I think is so funny.
It's
so
ridiculous.
Good. Makes me wonder if there's like an area of like arbor tech or something that they're trying to coin to get a bunch of VC funding into it and whatnot. But what's been said about like engineering as a culture and as a way of intervening in systems, like it works when things are simple or complicated, but once you're getting into more complex situations, that approach of like linear cause effect is like becomes more nebulous and more unclear. And so maybe you need like other ways of tinkering, because I'm not against tinkering at all. Like I don't think there's a problem with genetic engineering on its own. Like Rob said, it's the commercial dynamics of like a Terminator seed just sounds pretty terrible. But what if we called it, or not just called it, because words like have effects, but actually thought of it as like genetic cultivation in the way that agriculture, culture, like we're culturing, like genetic culture was like the way that we thought about it. And that involved other modes of like bucketing what genes are and what genes do and what like things in the ecosystem do and all of that. And I think that would probably get to some of like Ryan's topics around like value inside of an ecosystem. But yeah, it just made me think of like the language we're using for it and the limits of a kind of like engineering mindset where you're just like optimizing one variable, but it's not a car engine, it's not going to run. A tree doesn't run at 40 horsepower every day for 30 years, right? That's not what it looks like.
That's why I go back to the whole, like in a lot of like indigenous knowledge systems, it's like we all exist in relation to each other, and kind of like the peak of that like neoliberal cultural impulse is like taking a tree and being like, okay, how do we make it like the Tesla of trees? It's like, well, it exists within a system. I don't know if it can if that's how it would work, but I don't know.
I just think like it's just one thing to make a solution, but it doesn't address the problem. I mean, I'm definitely with tinkering and our ability to like use the education and the skills that we have to do that. I think there's like a lot of good that comes out of that. I feel like if people like were able to monetize solving the problems that like created these solutions, then maybe we would be like better spending our energy in some cases.
The other way to put this is that like it's going to happen, and so that you need to like think through that, like whatever wishful thinking we have around people not deploying last minute solutions to the climate crisis, like stuff's going to be deployed. Like, in any case, like it's going to happen in some form, and it's a question of like how to govern it in maybe like a more democratic way than the way it's being made out at the moment, and same with this like genetic engineering stuff. I'm like all for like a democratically controlled like genetic cultivation.
I'm just more like, once I read that article and then I read more about the legal and the scientific consensus around it, it just kind of felt like the tech sector going out on a limb and being like, okay, like this is the solution, guys, like we got this. And just, I don't know, just seeing how like haphazard that is. But yeah, it's hard because you also have these crazy stats that are like, oh, we only have 50 more harvests left, or and if in 20 years, if we don't do X, like, this is going to happen. So you have these timelines, and the people who have money or who are trying to fix the problem are like, okay, well, what are our available solutions right now?
Yeah, it's funny though that you bring that up, because the other thing that makes me distrust it is the confidence, right? It's like,
it's too confident.
It's like if they feel like they've got it, like, so, like it's like, no, like this definitely needs to be approached as like there's going to be mistakes, so let's take some precautions, understanding that if you're going that. I wonder about the compatibility of like GMO permaculture, and like, can such a thing exist or not? We can imagine it, but what does it actually look like, and what is that kind of care and respect for the like, and we go back in like full circle to the natural ways or the holistic approach to doing some of these things. What does that look like, or can there be such a thing?
Nature is literally only genetic modification. It's just a giant stew of just like monsters and abnormalities constantly being like bred together.
There's two perspectives. It's like, obviously we've been modifying things like forever, but the CRISPR stuff is recent, and that is more, it's unclear about what exactly we're doing there.
You could say we've been genetically modifying forever, but I blame the wheat, was it? I blame the wheat. They're domesticating us. A signal or a noise, Ryan?
I think I would say like a noisy signal. I think it actually reminds me of like Jurassic Park in a way, because we're doing that sort of like, we have the ability, so we're just not really thinking it through. There's also that like, level of exploitation that happens with like somebody comes in and it's like, oh, there's a rush to this problem, and then like, here's this really great solution that's going to make me a ton of money, which always just, feels a bit weird. I think the part that's interesting there for me is the tech space. If you hadn't said it, I think I would have just thought about it in terms of like bioengineering or something. Yeah, like the consideration that this is a kind of like technology focused solution is interesting to me. The technology is at a level that is a little bit, it's giving me a bit of cognitive dissonance between like what I would consider a technology, an instrument, or like a product, and what the kind of ramifications are of that experiment. So I think maybe, there's a distinction there that's like such a small scale, it can still be kind of a technology or technological apparatus, but I wouldn't put it in the tech space. I wouldn't have done it before you mentioned it. Yeah.
Jeremy, signal or noise?
Yeah, I think it's a signal. I mean, I think it's a signal that is sort of related to my signal in the sense that this is, again, leaning into a solution that says that we need to be adding more, creating something new. So it kind of is counterpoint again, or maybe it's part of the same like Dyson signal. And yeah, we're not really like relying on nature to tell us what's better. We're just like, we need a solution now and we need to figure it out. And I totally get that. But I don't necessarily agree that it's the best way to go about it. But I still think it is a signal of potentially leaning into climate change in a much different tech focused way.
Valdez, signal or noise?
I think it's a signal, because I framed it in terms of like, we don't know what an economy based on having a price for carbon is going to look like, because that's a really weird thing that we're doing, and it's the solution that's being provided, like it or not, by the system. With the next like 20, 30 years, like that's the tool we have. Like that's what it's going to be. There aren't other tools. Like there isn't going to be a giant direct investment democratically controlled into climate mitigation. There's going to be a carbon price, and so what that'll look like is going to be very weird. This kind of Tesla of trees approach and all these VCs hyping up their approaches. I think like, barring moral judgment, it's going to be like interesting to see what that even looks like, and deeply weird. And I say weird because like an economy based on like market prices, it's all about like what benefits the individual, right? And so that's what money works. You buy stuff because you personally want it. You don't buy stuff because it's good for like a collective good. But that's what a carbon price is trying to do. It's trying to make a collective good individually worth it. Because like without that carbon price, there's no reason anyone would buy these genetically modified trees unless somebody gives them money back through this carbon price mechanism. So I don't know if we've like organized an economy around explicitly pursuing or use market mechanisms to explicitly pursue collective goods, but that's what we're going to try, and it's going to be very weird. And I don't really know what to say about it other than I don't know. It's just the strangeness is going to be something.
So
we're
many
in for a ride.
Strange and interesting ways to see how these how this loops back to the other signals we've talked about today. This is a really cool sort of scenario space to start exploring as well. And it'll be interesting to like think about this and think about planning the deployment of technology like this in light of like evaluating what we've experienced and know about the successes and failures of genetic modification in food. There's like a lot to look at there and consider as sort of how to approach something like this. Erica, signal or noise?
I'm wondering if they can even be considered trees because they are genetically modified.
Can they be considered persons?
Yeah, what are they? And then on a small scale, like what you mentioned, Jack, with like them being these entities that you have to take care, that everyone wants to like take care of in a certain way. It kind of reminded me of like I Dream of Androids and Electric Sheep situation where everyone wants these entities in some way or desires them. And so just like, what do stewards look like for this space? And also, I guess, tree equity when it comes down to it. So yeah, signal for me.
Yeah, signal for me. Broadcast from later.